I'm Daniel Biss, I'm state senator in the 9th District, running for governor of Illinois, and I really appreciate this conversation. And I was asked to come here and speak specifically about one issue, which is the question of pensions and the way that I have approached the pension debt problem and the way that I think we ought to deal with the pension debt problem going forward. And so I'm going to speak to that quickly, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I'm happy to take more questions on that topic or about anything else. But I do want, particularly here in this community that is so anchored by a public institution, to say a word about this question of the $130 billion in pension debt that are such a challenge for the state's budget. When I arrived in the Illinois legislature, it was January of 2011. We were in the middle of this horrendous recession. The pension debt was not quite as large as it is now, but large and growing, and it was placing significant pressures on our state's budget. And there was a lot of push to say we've got to do something about the pension debt, and the options that were presented at the time, the options that kind of the elites who were essentially in control of the state discourse presented were either you keep on cutting services for the most vulnerable people, either you cut education and healthcare and human services and home care for the elderly and care for individuals with disabilities, or else you make unilateral changes to the state's pension system. So those are the only two choices presented to us. And I handled that situation wrong. What I did in that situation was to kind of accept that choice, to say these are not really great options, but I'm going to take what I see as the best of those bad options and move forward with a proposal to make unilateral changes to pension benefits. That proposal was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court in April of 2015. And what I will tell you, humbly and somewhat contritely, is that the Supreme Court was right. The Supreme Court was right, and here's why the Supreme Court was right. This idea that we only had those two choices was wrong. It actually wasn't true. Those were two choices that were proposed by a certain set of self-interested people, but in fact there are a lot of other options on the table. In fact, our tax code in Illinois is antiquated. It's trapped in the 1970s when our Constitution was written. In fact, Illinois is a state with extraordinary affluence. In fact, if you were to look at the list of the most affluent states in the country, you would find Illinois right near the top of the list. And we have the resources to meet our commitments, our promised commitments to public employees, as well as to properly fund education, healthcare, and human services, if we have the courage to change our tax code and to make the difficult but necessary, obviously necessary decisions that our state government has failed to make over the course of decades because of who's in control. And it's not that I didn't know that, I knew that, but I somehow accepted this story that there's just no politically possible way to do those necessary changes in our tax code unless we first do this other project of making unilateral changes to pension benefits. And that was a fundamental misunderstanding of the job of an elected leader. An elected leader is not a pundit. An elected leader's job is not to say, hey, here's what I see as possible today, and so let's do it. An elected leader's job is to say, here's what we ought to do, but this is what's possible today, and so I'm going to change what's possible. And I wish that I had done that rather than just accepting these two bad choices as our only options on the menu. But I want to tell you that it was a very important learning experience for me, and one that really transformed my vision of what my job in this state government is. When we accept the prison of what received wisdom tells us is the only thing that's politically possible, we doom ourselves to repeating the same mistakes that got us to where we are today, because of course we got here by following our intuitions about what was politically possible. Our job is to change what's politically possible, and we can do that by building the right kind of political campaign. We can do that by organizing people in support of a genuine progressive agenda, and we can do that by not hemming ourselves in as a result of conventional wisdom. And so I want to give you an example of how that lesson has been important to me, and I think back to the budget negotiation that we had in Springfield in May. The state had not had a budget at that point for almost 2 years. As it turns out, we wound up not having a budget for 2 years and 6 days before we finally enacted a budget years too late on July 6th of this year. And so there was a desperate feeling of we got to pass whatever budget we possibly can because the human cost of not having a budget is simply unacceptable. And certainly for me to come here to this town of all towns, you don't need me to explain to you the cost to this community of the state not having had a budget for 2 years. And so there was a budget that was proposed. It was not the budget that we ought to have. It was not the budget that I would like. It is not the budget that I will advance as governor of Illinois. It is not a budget that solved the decades-long errors and injustices built into our tax code. It was not a budget that finally provided all the needed resources for our public system of higher education, but was a budget that was a heck of a lot better than doing nothing at all. And so most people thought our choices were do nothing at all or enact this budget, and so therefore voted yes. But I wanted to first do what I could to expand the framework of possibilities before accepting an option that was way better than the status quo, but nowhere close to good enough. And so what I did was, I'd been working on a bill that closes something called the carried interest tax loophole. The carried interest tax loophole is an obscure loophole in the federal tax code that allows hedge fund and private equity fund managers to, this is true, so it sounds like it is made up, that allows hedge fund and private equity fund managers to take their income and reclassify it as though it were not income, and therefore take home a 20% tax cut. I'll say it again. They earn income, then they reclassify it on their tax returns as not being income, as being a capital gain instead, even though it's not, and that gives them a 20% tax cut. It's unjust, it's illogical, it's unfair, it's a giant windfall to quite literally the richest people that the world has ever known. And in this last presidential campaign, not only Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, but also Jeb Bush and Donald Trump all campaigned on a platform of we're going to do away with this loophole. Now, Donald Trump didn't know what he meant, I'm sure, but they all put that in their platforms, they all said that's what they believed. Because the truth is, anybody who's analyzed the situation agrees that it's just a corrupt loophole that never should have been there. Well, Trump got elected president, unfortunately. I have trouble saying that sentence, but I guess I got through it that time. And surrounded himself with titans of the financial industry in his cabinet, and then, surprisingly, they weren't so interested in closing this loophole. And the rest of us had two choices. We could either say it's too bad that they're not doing what they promised they would do in Washington, or we could say, given that they're not doing it, we're going to take our responsibility on the state level to do the job they should be doing. And so state legislators across the country started trying to close this loophole on the state level and then use that revenue that should have been paid in taxes in the first place to close state budget problems. It's a more fair, more progressive, more sensible, more sound mechanism to solve our budget problems than the one that was proposed. And so I went to the Senate President, John Collins, and I said, listen, we should pass this budget you're talking about, but we should improve it first. Let's make sure that we also find the votes to pass this bill closing the carried interest tax loophole here on the state level in Illinois. This is a bill that the Wall Street lobby had killed in every single other state that tried to pass it. But we decided that we were going to do it here in Illinois, and we found the votes to pass that out of the Senate. A landmark piece of legislation that's hopefully going to change the way this question is thought about in other states. And so I tell you that to indicate that it is possible to break out of this prison of false choices between bad options that are presented to us by self-interested actors. And that's the kind of conduct that I think we need a governor who's willing to engage in. I think we need a governor who looks at a bunch of problems in Illinois, who looks at decades of conventional wisdom that have served us poorly and says, we're going to remake our system anew and not ask ourselves, what are we expected to do, and not ask ourselves what have we done before, and not ask ourselves what is politically easy to do, but ask ourselves what actually should we be doing here. And then if that's an answer that's impossible to enact, the job is to figure out how to go and do it. And that's the lesson that I learned from this very painful pension episode, and that's the lesson that I will bring to the governor's office, and it's a lesson that I think we need a governor to have learned, because we need a governor who's not going to be trapped by the status quo. And so I just felt that it was important to come and tell that story in this town of all towns, to this community of all communities. And I'm now happy to open up for questions, either about this narrow topic or anything else under the sun. Yep.
I have a question about your general candidacy. From what I've read, it seems you've had two camps in your life, your professional life so far, when you're an academic and now as a politician. And I see, you know, some of your history in both of those as having two big blunders. You know, excuse me, but two big blunders. As far as your academic career, you made some fame and notoriety for yourself by publishing a few papers on manifolds, and they were put into very good mathematical journals for which, you know, you were applauded for. But as you know, a Russian mathematician found that the math that was involved in your proofs was fatally flawed, and so you were forced to withdraw those publications from the press. And I imagine that affected, you know, being at the University of Chicago too, your publication record, maybe your tenure track. I don't know about those details. I'm just speculating now. Now, at that time, then you also decided you'd switch horses and go into politics. And you're most famous for what you just talked about, and that is the SB1 bill, because it was the bill that you co-sponsored that had the most far-reaching effects to the state of Illinois. But again, a big blunder, a catastrophe, really, I would call it, because, of course, it enraged state employees. I was at Eastern Illinois University. We spent 2 years raging against that bill that you co-sponsored. We'd go to Springfield, we'd rally, we'd send postcards, we'd make phone calls for 2 years. And we got nowhere. Of course, it was passed, like you said, and ultimately the Supreme Court of Illinois deemed it to be illegal. And it went up in flames. So what was the outcome of that? Nothing good. That bill that you co-sponsored not disenfranchised, but disappointed so many Democrats. And I know some of them, good Democrats, said, I'm not voting on the Democratic ticket this time around when Quinn went up for governorship. And some of them said they were even going to vote for Rauner, but they were good Democrats otherwise. And Rauner won by a sliver, and I think it's a fair statement that some have proposed that a lot of the blame for Rauner coming to power and wreaking the devastation that he's done must be laid at your feet because of the SB1 bill. So now you want us to endorse you as governor to fix the mess that you helped create. And so my question, I guess, here is, why did it take you almost 4 years to come to the conclusion from 2013 to now that it was a mistake? Because I saw a video of you in 2013 being not apologetic and being defensive about that bill when you were being challenged by some retired professors, or teachers rather. And then I met you about 1.5 years ago in Mattoon at an event that the local Democrats put on. And I asked you about the SB after you gave your talk, and you were equally defensive and non-apologetic. So now I'm here, and I hear that you went on Fred Klansky's radio show, and you were apologetic. So I assume that's true. And I hear today that, yes, you regret having done what you did, but why did it take so long? And excuse me for being cynical, but happens to coincide when you're running for governor. So can you, calm my fears about your record and what that's all about?
Around my academic record, I've published dozens of papers, and it's very normal in the course of academic life for subsequent academics to come and poke holes, and I think my academic record was strong, and I'm proud of a lot of the work that I did, the great majority of which, of course, did hold up, and I think that's a standard part of the push and pull of academic discourse. I'm happy to go into more detail about that if you're interested, but I think it's probably not what most people here are hoping to hear. So I'll say a couple things. The first thing is that I think your timing is a little bit off. Certainly for several years now, I've been giving a spiel almost identical to what I just said, since long before I was even considering running for governor, much less actually running. I spent a lot of time, a lot of sleepless nights during that effort and since that effort, thinking about what that all meant. And I think an important turning point was the Supreme Court decision. An important turning point was the Supreme Court decision that helped contextualize, as the courts are very useful in doing, not just what that narrow piece of legislation itself meant, but what the opportunities that the state of Illinois had at the time were. And if you recall, the argument that the Attorney General used to defend the bill in the court was exactly this kind of, hey, listen, this is this is rough, this is frustrating, this is hard, but really we had no choice, and so we had to. And that's the argument that people who supported the bill used, and that's the argument that the court shot down. And watching that argument play out, watching both sides make those arguments during the course of the previous year as the litigation happened, and seeing the court decision really made a big impact on me. And I don't want to go through the calendar in sort of an argumentative way, but I remember talking, in the summer of 2015 in a way that was almost identical to what I just said to you. So, but I don't know that that addresses the question. I think it's important to address the question in its full context. I have passed over 80 bills into law. Some of those were pretty close to irrelevant, right? Minor, modest, technical, passed unanimously, would have passed unanimously whether or not I'd ever been born, frankly. And some were very, very controversial and difficult to pass. And then this Senate Bill 1 is obviously very, very controversial and has been overturned by the Supreme Court. I'm proud of my record. And there's a lot that I have done that not only has withstood legal challenge, but has changed lives in Illinois. And it is certainly possible that in some circles I'm best known for that pension work. I would also say it's not the work that I think of most. It's not the work that I've pointed to when I ask people to contemplate my record. And so let me give you another example of something that I've worked on that was influenced in really significant ways by my thinking about this pension issue. The last 40 years or so, since I guess really the mid-70s and then accelerating in the early 80s, we've seen an erosion of defined benefit pensions in the private sector. Taken away partially because of certain federal legal changes, and then over time because of an inexorable trend to find ways to cut costs. And that has left us in a position here in 2017 where the typical retirement benefit that a private sector worker in America has is just inadequate. Just fundamentally inadequate. And so very, very few workers in the private sector have access to defined benefit pensions. The rest of the workforce, the overwhelming majority, about half have access to a 401k or some sort of mechanism to save for retirement through an employer, which usually in practice are significantly inadequate, leaving us now with a retirement savings gap of between $6 and $14 trillion a year, $6 and $14 trillion. And then about half the private sector workforce, so that's 2.5 million or so people in Illinois, many tens of millions of people across the country, lack access to any retirement plan at all through their employer. And most people in this situation save almost nothing and are almost entirely reliant on Social Security for their retirement, which is simply not adequate. And so the discourse that I walked into in Springfield in 2011, and the discourse that I still hear all the time, is, well, public employees have this kind of defined benefit pension and private sector employees have almost nothing, so why don't we just level down? So why don't we just ask the public sector to follow the private sector where it's already gone to the inevitable endpoint of doing away with pensions and doing away with retirement plans and counting on people to fend for themselves. I hear that all the time. And starting before Senate Bill 1 was even passed, well before it was overturned, I recognized that if we wanted to have a politics around retirement that enabled us to create actual dignified retirement security for anybody, we'd have to be creating retirement security for everybody. And so we had to acknowledge this gap and transform the conversation from being one of leveling down to being one of leveling up. And I will tell you that at the time when I started talking about this, there was not a lot of conversation about this anywhere, and people kind of rolled their eyes at me. And so I started in 2013, again, before Senate Bill 1 was even passed, trying to enact a law to create a retirement plan for the 2.5 million workers in Illinois who lack access to any retirement plan at work whatsoever. This was something that had been talked about since 2005. It was something that President Obama had proposed. It was something that a lot of economists across the political spectrum had signed off on, and something that had been killed in not just Washington, but every single state capital where it had been considered by the life insurance lobby with help from the Wall Street lobby. And so I just decided, if we're going to eventually have retirement security for everybody, we're going to have to start this leveling up process, and we ought to just start here in Illinois. And so I traveled the state, and I fought for this bill, and I lobbied, and I argued, and I twisted arms, and I begged, and I pleaded, and my colleagues eventually figured out that I wasn't going to leave them alone until they voted for it. And so we passed the bill out of the Senate in April of 2014. So a year and a quarter after I first began working on this. And then we wanted to pass the bill out of the House before the session ended at the end of May, and we didn't have the votes. And so I spent the whole summer and the whole fall driving around the state, visiting state legislators in their offices, organizing community groups in church basements to try to bring pressure to bear on the legislature, meeting with editorial boards, just trying to do whatever I could to build the support needed. And then we had the November 2014 election with a terrible outcome for the state of Illinois. And then we were able to go back to Springfield for our fall veto session, and we passed the bill. And it was one of the last bills signed into law by Governor Quinn in January of 2015, one of the last bills that he signed. And since then, because people around the country saw that we were able to get this done, California's done the same thing, Oregon, Maryland, Vermont, Connecticut. There's now a series of states across the country that are moving in this direction, trying finally, for the first time in literally a generation, to in a serious way take on the retirement security challenge and lift up people who have not had adequate access to any kind of secure retirement. And I'm proud of that. I think it's certainly the most significant thing I've achieved in the legislature. It's going to take some time to implement, by the way, and it's not been an unbumpy road to implement it as well. There's a 7-member board chaired by the state treasurer. It's got appointees from Rauner on it that are working to implement it, and it's been difficult but so far successful process to get them working together to act collaboratively. And it's going to be a long road to do that. But it's going to be doable. And it's going to change the basic landscape of a lot of people entering retirement in the Illinois experience. And so I give you that example for 3 reasons. One, because I like it. It's something that I'm proud of, something I've worked hard on, something that would not have happened had I not become a legislator, not just here, but in a number of other states around the country. But I also give the example to indicate that as I was grappling with this pension debt challenge, I was thinking broadly about it. I was not just focused on doing one thing that turned out to be a bad idea. I was thinking about a lot of different fronts, and I was thinking about what's the long-term path that will enable us to have a system that actually works for everybody. And I will say that both of these projects, one that we now agree was a bad idea, and one that I personally believe was a really good idea, were risky. They were risky. They were bold and complicated and controversial efforts to tackle a giant problem in the state of Illinois. A giant problem in the state of Illinois. And I think that we've had in our politics a lack of willingness to take risks. And I don't mean that that means that you should be happy that I took a risk on something that turned out to be unwise. And I don't mean to suggest that I shouldn't have been able to figure that out beforehand. But I do think that in this moment, as we contemplate the depth of challenge that we have before us in the state, the question that we should be selecting for isn't, is everything you've ever done worked out well? It's, are you willing to think outside the box? Are you willing to assume political risk? Are you willing to do things that other people are unwilling to do? Are you willing to try to restructure the question of what's possible in the state of Illinois? Because if we're not willing to do that, then God help us. And I would ask you to consider whether that's an important question, an important test to put to a potential governor. Because I think if we find ourselves just walking down the same narrow path we've walked down before, we're going to land in the same place we've landed before, and that's not a good place. promise to give a shorter answer to other questions you guys might have. Please.
I have no idea what the answer is, so can you give me a report on the status of state-funded pensions in Illinois today?
So there are 5 state-funded pensions. The question is, what's the report on the status of state-funded pensions in Illinois today? There are 5 state-funded pensions in Illinois, one for the state university employees, one for teachers with the exception of Chicago public school teachers, one for state employees, one for legislators, and one for judges. The status is not good. The status is not good. I alluded earlier to about $130 billion of debt in those systems. The funding ratio is still under 50%. It's climbing up very, very gradually in the low 40s, I believe. And we are on a 50-year funding schedule. So that's really dumb. If you were to ask, I think as we need to ask, well, how did we get here? How did we find ourselves with $130 billion of pension debt? How did we land in a place where our pensions are more underfunded than any other states by many measures? The most significant and crucial answer is that for not just a few years or decades, but literally for many generations, we failed to make the proper payments. We failed to make payments that actuaries would say are responsible and necessary. And so here we are now on a 50-year payment schedule that no actuary in the world would have signed off on. That was enacted in the mid-1990s by a group of politicians who happened upon a project, a mechanism to fund pensions that they said, we'll just sort of start by paying very, 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 very little and then have a ramp that accelerates after we all retire. And it worked, and now State Representative Carol Ammons, this is the back of the room, welcome Carol, and I are left at the top of the ramp paying these much larger amounts. The good news is that the ramp is now kind of leveled off, so we're no longer expected to put a much larger number in next year than this year and the following year than the next year. And so if the payments are actually being made as they should be made now, we're on schedule to eventually pay all this debt down. And now we're so many years into the 50-year ramp that we're no longer on a time horizon that is fundamentally risky and irresponsible. But I will tell you that even this year's budget negotiation featured an effort by Rauner to delay more pension payments, to recalculate the way that we compute what's supposed to be put in, and that recalculation has the effect of making us pay less now and more later. And so the temptation, which is apparently irresistible for Illinois governors of both parties, to not pay now and instead pay more later, or actually instead have somebody else pay more later after they retire, is a temptation that not only should we resist, and I can commit to you right now that when I'm governor I won't sign a budget that doesn't fund the pensions responsibly, but we should do better than that and institutionalize. Because in fact, there's one non-state funded large pension system in Illinois that's doing fine. That's the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. That's the pension fund for municipal employees for most municipal governments except for Chicago and Cook County. For example, the people who work at the library are members of the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. So that system is in really good shape. Why? What's different about it? What's different is that every single year, come rain or come shine, the employers make the appropriate payments into the fund. Why do they do that? Is it out of the goodness of their heart? Is it because they understand actuarial science? No, it's because they have to. And if they don't, they lose state funding to the extent that it's not worth trying in the first place. And if you're able to institutionalize a process whereby actuarially responsible payments are made every single year, you'll be fine. The Texas teachers' pension system, by the way, has a constitutional guarantee not of the benefit, but of the funding. So the legislature in Texas has to pay to the teachers' pension system an actuarially responsible amount of money every single year, and so they do. And so that pension system is in good shape as well. So what we need to learn from this is don't just, in a particular year when it's politically convenient, put the right amount of money in. Change the rules so that the legislature has no choice but to put the right amount of money in. And if we do that, then it'll still take a few decades, but we'll be just fine. We have time for only one more. What's that?
I have a non-pension question.
Great.
So when you're governor, what's the first thing that you're going to focus on?
The original sin in Illinois budgeting, in my opinion, is the flat tax provision in our Constitution. We are one of only 4 states in the Union, one of 4 states in the Union whose Constitution says that we must have a flat income tax, whose Constitution says that it would be illegal to ask Bruce Rauner, who in 2015 made $188 million, to pay a higher tax rate than the person who works in this library. That is, on its face, ludicrous. It results in a deeply unjust tax system. So for instance, in Illinois, if you're in the bottom 5th, your total state and local tax burden is around 13%. 13% if you're at the bottom. If you're in the top 1%, it's about 4%. So at the bottom people pay 13, at the top people pay 4. That's crazy. That's crazy. That's in large part because of the flat tax provision of our Constitution, which has not just created an unfair, unjust tax system, one of the most regressive tax systems of any state in the Union. It has also made it impossible for us to capture adequate revenue because during the 47 years since that was enacted in the Constitution in 1970, during those 47 years, as the economy has grown, almost all the new money's gone to the top, and we haven't been able to touch that without also taxing middle-class people and the working poor who have not gotten a raise. And so this is an important distinction in this race, but it's a subtle distinction. Because fortunately, almost all the Democratic candidates for governor say they support making the change that we need to make, which is to say repealing the flat tax provision of the Constitution. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. So have the other Democratic governors we've had before. So have Democratic candidates for governor we've had before. It's easy to say, yes, we ought to change it. What's important is not just to say we ought to change it. What's important is to say that's the original sin. That's the thing that must be repealed if we're going to meet with success. That is the only option we have if we want a long-term, sustainable budget situation in the state of Illinois, and that's why that is my first priority. That's why I'm going to win on a Tuesday evening, and on Wednesday morning I'm going to be meeting with the 4 legislative leaders. So today that would be Madigan and Cullerton and Durkin and Brady, and maybe it'll be the same people later, maybe not, who knows. I'll meet with those 4 legislative leaders and say, listen, I've been elected governor, I'm just, governor against a co-equal branch of government in the legislature. I'm going to need to be flexible. I'm going to need to be willing to compromise. I am willing to compromise, but this is something we must do together. Let's sit down now, the 5 of us, and figure out what it takes to find the 36 votes we need in the Senate, the 71 votes we need in the House to put this referendum on the ballot. Not because that's going to get me any big political wins quickly. In fact, governors who knew this was the right thing to do have neglected to actually do it because it doesn't give them any big political wins the next day, but because if we want things to be where they have to be a decade later, this is the only way to do it. And so when I first started running for office in 2007, and what, by the way, is one of the most affluent parts of the state of Illinois, where having more progressive taxation is not popular, I nonetheless went knocking on doors and said, this is what we got to do. This is what we must do if we want to have a sustainable fiscal environment in Illinois. We need to just match the other states around us and most of the states in the union and have a fair tax code. I've been advocating for this since literally the first day I was in politics in Illinois. I'm advocating for it today. And when I'm governor, it's going to be the first priority. And that's going to mean that 10 years later, the basic fiscal environment in Illinois will be fundamentally different from what it is now. And that, to me, is on the ballot in this primary. Not the question of, is this a theoretically good idea, but the question of, are we actually going to make it happen? And that's the question that ought to be answered. So thank you for that question. It turns out to be my favorite question. And thank you so much for this conversation.